Question 91. The principle of greatest happiness of the greatest number. Introduction. The ethical foundation of utilitarianism. The principle of greatest happiness of the greatest number is the central doctrine of utilitarianism, a moral and political philosophy that arose in the late 18th and early 19th centuries in England. It was first introduced by Jeremy Bentham, 1748 to 1832, and later refined by John Stuart Mill, 1806 to 1873. This principle became a cornerstone of modern liberal democratic thought, linking ethics, law, and public policy to the promotion of human welfare and happiness. In essence, it asserts that the right action or policy is the one that produces the greatest amount of happiness or pleasure for the greatest number of people. Meaning and essence of the principle. The greatest happiness of the greatest number means that the moral worth of any action is determined by its contribution to overall utility, that is, the net happiness or pleasure it produces over pain or suffering. Thus, an action, law, or government policy is morally justified only if it maximizes happiness and minimizes misery for the majority of people. Example: a government policy like free education or healthcare is considered morally right if it brings more happiness to society by improving lives than harm, such as cost or inconvenience. This principle links morality with consequences. It is consequentialist, not based on intention or divine command, but on the outcomes of actions. 2. Origin and development of the principle. 1. Jeremy Bentham, founder of utilitarianism. Jeremy Bentham, in his seminal work, An Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation, 1789, formulated the principle of utility, declaring, "It is the greatest happiness of the greatest number that is the measure of right and wrong." Bentham argued that pleasure and pain are the two sovereign masters of human life. Every human action aims either to seek pleasure or to avoid pain. Hence, the standard of morality should be the greatest net balance of pleasure over pain produced by an action. This approach made morality scientific and calculable, replacing abstract ideals like divine will or natural law with empirical human experience. 2. John Stuart Mill, qualitative refinement. While Bentham's utilitarianism was quantitative, concerned with the amount of pleasure, J.S. Mill introduced a qualitative distinction, arguing that not all pleasures are equal. He wrote in Utilitarianism, 1861, "It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied, better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied." Mill emphasized that intellectual and moral pleasures are superior to physical pleasures, thereby humanizing Bentham's rather mechanical view. For Mill, utility meant happiness in the highest sense, including mental, moral, and social well-being. 3. Core principles of the greatest happiness doctrine. 1. Pleasure and pain as the basis of morality. Human beings naturally seek pleasure and avoid pain. Thus, moral actions are those that maximize pleasure and minimize pain for the most people. Bentham's utilitarianism is therefore hedonistic, pleasure-centered, but socially oriented, aiming at collective well-being. 2. Consequentialism. The morality of an action is judged not by motives but by its consequences. A good action is one that produces good results, specifically happiness. Example: a judge's decision is moral if it increases social welfare and justice, not merely because it follows abstract rules. 3. Universalism. The principle does not privilege any individual or group. It demands equal consideration of every person's happiness, each to count for one and none for more than one, as Bentham stated. Thus, it promotes moral impartiality and democratic equality. 4. Quantification of happiness, Bentham's hedonic calculus. Bentham proposed a method to measure happiness through what he called the hedonic calculus. He suggested that every action could be evaluated by considering the intensity, duration, certainty, propinquity, fecundity, purity, and extent of pleasure it produces. Example: if a social welfare program provides long-term benefits to a large population, it is morally superior to a policy offering short-term relief to a few. 5. Social and legislative application. The principle provides a moral foundation for law and governance. Bentham argued that the purpose of law should be to promote the happiness of the community, not to enforce tradition or authority. Hence, legislators and rulers must frame policies that maximize collective welfare, a notion that inspired democratic, legal, and welfare state reforms in modern politics. 4. Political and ethical implications. 1. Foundation of democratic government. The utilitarian idea that government must act for the greatest happiness of the greatest number laid the moral foundation of democracy. In a democracy, laws and policies are judged by their utility for the majority, not the privilege of a few. Thus, sovereignty rests not in kings but in the welfare of the people. Example: welfare schemes, progressive taxation, and universal franchise all reflect utilitarian ideals of maximizing public good. 2. Basis of modern welfare state. The principle underlies the social and economic role of the modern state. It justifies state intervention to reduce suffering and ensure basic needs like health, education, and social security. Example: public health programs, labor laws, and environmental regulations are utilitarian in nature. They promote overall well-being. 3. Ethical guidance for public policy. Utilitarianism remains a guiding framework in public administration, law, and economics. Policies are assessed in terms of cost-benefit analysis, whether they produce more happiness than harm for society. Example: governments use utilitarian reasoning when balancing economic growth with environmental protection, seeking maximum collective benefit. Criticisms of the principle. Despite its moral appeal, the greatest happiness principle has faced several criticisms from philosophers and ethicists. 1. Quantitative reductionism. Critics argue that Bentham's attempt to measure happiness reduces complex human experiences to numbers. Pleasure and pain are qualitative, subjective states that cannot be precisely quantified. 2. Neglect of justice and minority rights. If the goal is only the happiness of the majority, it could justify injustice to minorities. A policy benefiting the majority at the expense of a few may be useful but morally wrong. Example: discriminatory laws could be defended if they make the majority happy, violating principles of human rights. 3. Ignoring motive and character. Utilitarianism focuses on results, not intentions or moral character. But many philosophers, like Kant, argued that morality lies in the intention to do right, not in the outcome. 4. Short-term versus long-term consequences. Immediate happiness may not lead to lasting welfare. A utilitarian calculus may prioritize short-term pleasure over long-term moral or environmental sustainability. Example: overuse of natural resources may increase short-term happiness but harm future generations. 5. Practical impossibility of calculation. In real life, it is impossible to calculate all the consequences of an action for every individual. The hedonic calculus may work in theory but not in complex societies. 6. Contemporary relevance and application. Despite its flaws, the greatest happiness principle remains highly relevant in public ethics and governance. Modern democracies implicitly apply it in welfare economics, measuring social welfare through utility. Public policy design, weighing benefits versus costs. Legal reform, ensuring laws promote fairness and social well-being. Example: India's social welfare programs, MNREGA, public health care, education, and subsidies reflect the utilitarian spirit of maximizing collective happiness and reducing suffering. 7. Summary for quick understanding. Meaning: the greatest happiness of the greatest number means that actions or policies are moral if they produce the maximum happiness and minimum pain for the majority. Founders: Jeremy Bentham, quantitative, and J.S. Mill, qualitative. Philosophy: consequentialist and hedonistic morality judged by outcomes. Applications: basis for democracy, welfare state, and public policy. Criticisms: ignores justice, minority rights, motive, and long-term impacts. Relevance: continues to guide modern governance, law, and ethics. Quick revision notes. Bentham. Calculus. Mill. Quantitative pleasure, hedonic. Qualitative pleasure, moral refinement. Essence. Morality is equal to maximum happiness, minimum pain. Utility. Actions. Criticism. The test of good and evil in all. Ignores justice, motive, and minority welfare. Modern relevance. Welfare policies, cost. Benefit analysis, democratic ethics. One-line questions and answers for revision. 1. Who introduced the principle of greatest happiness of the greatest number? Jeremy Bentham. 2. What is the core idea of this principle? The right action maximizes happiness for the greatest number. 3. What kind of philosophy is utilitarianism? Consequentialist and hedonistic. 4. Who refined Bentham's utilitarianism by distinguishing higher and lower pleasures? J.S. Mill. 5. What is Bentham's method of measuring happiness called? Hedonic calculus. 6. Which moral test does utilitarianism apply? Utility: pleasure over pain. 7. What is a key criticism of this theory? It may justify injustice to minorities. 8. What is its political implication? Foundation of democracy and welfare. State. 9. Which modern policy approach reflects utilitarianism? Cost-benefit analysis. 10. What is its enduring legacy? Linking morality and governance with collective welfare. Final connection. The principle of greatest happiness of the greatest number transformed moral philosophy by grounding ethics in human welfare and rational calculation rather than divine or traditional authority. It made happiness, justice, and social welfare the true measure of good governance. Though imperfect, it continues to inspire democratic societies, reminding us that the ultimate test of every law, policy, or action lies in how much happiness it brings to the many, not the few. As Bentham envisioned, the care of human happiness is the first and only object of good government.